I'm Ben Carson, and I'm a candidate for President of the United States.
And I've decided I'm a candidate for President of the United States of America.
I have decided to run for President of the United States.
America will be greater than ever. Thank you, and may God bless you and the United States of America.
This year's election was very unusual from ones in the past. For starters, we had a female candidate representing the Democratic Party and a celebrity businessman representing the Republican Party. Many didn't agree with the outcome of this election. Everyone was happy when it was over. This has been a record-long election season of 596 days since last March when Ted Cruz announced he was running. But the first voting period after Cruz's announcement was 315 days later in the primaries. There are many aspects one might want to change about the way this past election was conducted, but I am just going to cover one reform, that being a shorter election season. This was inspired by an interview with singer Sheryl Crow, who took the initiative of starting a petition to the DNC and RNC to shorten the election by changing the time the primaries are held.
I think what went wrong in this past election was social media, hearsay, fake news happened. Too long of a period of time for the election to occur. I think, in my opinion, advertising and the election should be shorter to save money. In my ideal world, I would have a list of questions and topics that a candidate would vote for. And the candidate would fill out, I would vote for this, and this is why. And then everyone could just decide that way. And it's not on hearsay, it's not on debates and who's a better speaker and who looks better. It's totally policy driven, and that way the candidates will be held accountable for what they vote for because they have promised that they will vote for something.
No other country does the election season quite like the US, which has limited laws regulating the campaign process. Canada and the UK have parliament systems which result in shorter party-driven elections. Canada's election cycle is constrained by the dissolving of Parliament, which leaves the window for the election campaigns. We were already 123 days into our election when Canada's record-long election was starting. Theirs, of course, was only 78 days before we even held the first vote. France has specific campaign length restrictions of 2 weeks, and Mexico recently changed their regulations to control at what point advertisements can appear. In Brazil, UK, and Japan, candidates can't even purchase TV ads, and Argentina limited ads to only appear 60 days before the election. Other countries are constantly changing and reforming their election process with the changing media. So when did our campaigns get so long? Well, they weren't always prior. To 1976, campaigns always started within the election year. But with the ideological change of people no longer committed to and voting according to parties, the primaries became more important. The shorter election cycles work for these countries because it is more of a policy race than personality race like ours. Their outcomes are always rather predictable, unlike our horse race coverage. The US notoriously elect their president primarily based on personality and experience, no longer because of strong party ties. The people began to want a president that they could get a beer with. Strong parties are what drives the political process on parliamentary system and wouldn't work with our two-party system of loose voter commitment and crossover. Now with the responsibility of electing party candidates falls on the voters, therefore states are now competing to be earlier in the primaries and hoping of having more influence on the rest of the country. As seen in the previous primaries, many dropped out after the first few states voted, and a trend was beginning to show. The two important features to evaluate when considering an election season reform is the effect on funding and voter knowledge. Other nations spend a mere couple millions on campaigns compared to the US's billions spent. Our reason for a candidate to announce their run so early is to get the process of funding going. The Clinton campaign raised over $1 billion and spent just near that in the last election cycle. Even Trump, who was always far behind on funding, spent nearly $500 million. According to New York Times, that equals $859,538 spent per Trump electoral vote versus about $1.97 million spent per Clinton electoral vote. So what is the reason for all this spending? One important voter influence that candidates try to win over early on is name recognition, that their name just needs to be familiar to you in the race. With the 17 Republican candidates in the first primaries, it is no wonder they fought just to be known. Therefore, incumbents are frequently re-elected because voters are already familiar with their name, regardless sometimes of how much they know about them. A candidate who can't afford to keep up with the advertisement, spending, and campaign visits can't remain in the presidential race. Those who run out of money to air their ads drop out early on, making the presidency a slot for only the wealthy or well-known. A shorter election would decrease the stamina and funds needed to be a candidate. Even Vice President Joe Biden said at 384 days away from Election Day that it was too late for him to run. That's insane that even the well-known Vice President saw 384 days out from Election Day was too late. The risk of the funding process in a shorter election is that a candidate with immediate access to large sums of money can't participate in the front-loading of the primaries. Meaning a candidate could put all of their money into the early primaries by immediately buying up advertising space, blocking opponents. Winning the early primaries can generate the bandwagon effect of states just following the opinions of earlier primaries. But with such a long election season, both candidates and the media had to keep the drama in the news cycle to stay relevant in Americans' minds, bringing the attention away from policy changes onto frivolous matters just to keep up the interest factor. Maybe there's a happy medium to having an election longer than 6 weeks but not so long that voters become uninformed. Though the election length is not to take the full blame as Americans continue the trend of focusing on soft news instead of hard news. A time restraint could be beneficial by putting the focus back on key issues and important information for voters to know. A concern with a time constraint is that there won't be enough time to really get to know a candidate in our personality-driven elections. Journalists would run the risk of not having enough time to conduct their investigations. This is a point made in this election when the controversial Trump Access Hollywood video only came out 500 days into the campaign. This important insight into the candidate would have never been seen by the American people with a shorter election. But with this last election, it is clear that it left voters more divided from 600 days of being a cheerleader for their candidate. Key issues all got deleted with the 600 days of election coverage. By the time final votes were cast, the nation was polarized into unsympathetic groups, each candidate disgusted by the other. So maybe a shorter election season would leave us better off after the next election, or it could leave us as uninformed and limited as ever.